Okay, so today we're going to try and show you a little bit about how to read a negative before you go into the darkroom. Before I do that, I'd like to show you a little bit about how film actually works. So what we've done is taken the piece of film that's inside your camera and blown that up into a cross section so you can see what it's made of. Here's the plastic base, that's the clear part that holds everything together, and then on top of that there's a very thin layer of gelatin called an emulsion, and within that emulsion are little silver halide crystals. And those crystals are just floating around in the emulsion until the film actually gets exposed to light, and then they react to the light. So your light source is behind the photographer in this case, and it's going to reflect off of the subject and back on through your lens and back onto the film inside of your camera. So I've drawn a little scene for you here, and you can tell from the drawing why I actually teach photography. Up here is bright sky. So that's going to create a tremendous amount of light reflecting back into your camera, and the result is a lot of those silver halide crystals are going to collect in the areas where they're being hit by the most sunlight, and that's why you can see all this density and this darkness up here in the negative. So what you see with those little blobs there are the grains of silver all coming to that area where the most light is. Now down in the middle, we all know that ninjas tend to dress in a black outfit, and black doesn't reflect much light. So when the light source hits the ninja absorbs most of the light, but a small portion does get reflected back onto the film. And if you notice there in the middle, that section of your negative doesn't have a lot of grains of silver. So it's very thin or very clear. And then of course, the ninja happens to be standing on some ground where there's some green grass. And in the black and white world, green translates to a mid-tone. So you have a medium thickness of the silver gelatin over here at the bottom. And that's what we call kind of a thin or medium density of the negative. Now, if you look over to the right, this is sort of our finished product. If you were to look at this negative on the light table, the sky would be represented by the super dark part over here, and we call that section of the negative dense. In the middle, where the ninja is, remember, not much light reflected back, so that's a very thin or clear section of your negative. And then again, down on the bottom where the green grass is, you'd get sort of a medium reflection, and that's why you see about half the amount of silver down in the midtones that you would up in the bright white sky. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples of actual negatives, and maybe even throw a print in there so you can see how this all works. So now I'd like to take a chance to show you a properly exposed negative and see if we can't put some of that density that we learned before to use on the negative. If you'll notice, first off, one of the most dense sections of this negative is right where you see almost the outline of a pair of sunglasses, and that's the base or the legs of the chair, and those are painted a bright white. So if you notice on the negative, they actually appear very dense or very dark. And that means that when the light from the enlarger tries to pass through this negative, it's going to be blocked by the density of that area, and the result on the paper is going to be a very bright white outline of the legs of those chairs. Now we'll show you some shadows as well. Just underneath the chair itself, you can see a rectangle of clear area on the negative. So again, the light's going to pass through there very quickly and easily and land on the paper and make a dark area where that shadow appears. Now the light is coming from the upper right side of this negative. It's about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and if you notice, her leg, her top leg that is blocking the light from landing underneath it. So you can see a clear area in the negative, and I'll zoom in to make that look a little bit, make that appear very easy for you to see. So there's a lot of shadow area right under that top leg, and you'll see that in the photo in just a second. Now if we look at the sky real quick, I can actually show you a part of this photo that's driven me nuts for years. Up here in the upper right corner, you can see the very tip of a willow leaf, and if I had noticed that at the time of the shot, I would have cropped that out. It's very clear. So in a very bright white sky, that's going to give you a very distracting black element in the photo, and it's driven me nuts until this day. Over here, it's a dark, dense area of the sky, so that's going to appear really white. And if you look in the middle, you see nothing but nice midtones, so you'll see some variation in the cloud, which is kind of cool. And then the last section I'll show you is the tip of the sailboat wing. And it was actually a very dark maroon, almost black in color. So you can see on the negative, it's very, very clear. So down here on the deck, you will see midtones. The nice brown wood appears as a gray midtone in the photo, and those bright white or clear lines that you see on the negative is actually the blank space between the boards, and so those will actually be showing up as shadows on the print. So here we have the final image, and you probably have already spotted all of the elements that we've discussed. If you look underneath the chair, you'll see that dark, pronounced rectangular shadow that appeared very clear on the negative. And you'll notice almost that outline of sunglasses where the bright white legs are on the bottom. And then if you look into that section where her leg is, you can see the dark shadows underneath that top leg. The sun's obviously coming from the upper right in this photo. We talked a little bit about how that sky would be bright white on the final print just above the sail. And the sail that was dark maroon or clear on the negative is pretty dark in this actual final print. And you can see some of the midtones in the clouds. And there's that very annoying compositional element that I wish I could have cropped out at the time of the photo. So there you see the opposite of the negative, which is the final print itself. And hopefully that gave you some insight as to how to read some of your own negatives. It's probably the most difficult part of beginning photography and printing. So if you do have questions about that, please don't hesitate to ask myself or Miss McAleese or Mr. Burgess. There are no silly questions in photography, and we're always willing to help you out because we really want you to have success with your prints. This might be a great time for the teacher to pause this and ask the students to read this negative, because there are very strong shadows and there are very strong highlights in this negative. Okay, hopefully you've guessed right, and you can tell that all of the dense portions of this negative, where the negative appears to be very dark, is going to produce a very bright section on the film. You can see the outline of the glasses again on the base of the chair. It's very dark here, so obviously that's going to come out bright white. But what's interesting about this particular photo is you can see a very strong shadow line just underneath the dock. So obviously the deck is blocking the sunlight, and you can see a ton of shadow under here where the shadow meets the water line. Same thing over here in this area where the ladder is. So where you see clear sections on a negative, you can just trust yourself that on the final print, that's going to be very dark or very dark gray. Up here, another reason why I didn't love this composition is I wasn't careful about what was in my frame, and I left a little bit of willow tree hanging up there. And if that were to come out in a final print, that would be a very black section of the negative, and it would be very distracting up in the sky. You can see here that the sail on this sailboat is very clear on the negative, so that obviously was a dark colored sail, and if I remember correct, it was a dark maroon color. That's why it seems to appear very clear on the negative. So hopefully this negative gives you a little bit more insight into what your final print's going to look like before you go into the darkroom. Okay, here real quickly, I just thought I would show you a negative that represents a silhouette. And if you notice in the left-hand side of this negative, it's very dark, very dense. So that obviously represents a very bright white sky. A lot of light was able to come through the lens and burn in that section of the negative. And then if you look at the person's face, there's almost no detail in the face whatsoever. So when the actual light goes through there from the enlarger to try to make a print, the person's face is going to come out almost black, very, very dark gray, and the sky is going to become very, very white. And that's how you would achieve a silhouette photo. So here we have a negative that was shot for an assignment we do called Who Shot That Photo? And if you notice, once again, the sky is very bright in the background. But in this case, it's not actually a silhouette because you still have some pretty good density in the facial features of both of these people, as well as their clothing. You can see some light and shadows and midtones in the clothing. So this, although very, very overexposed, could still make a really excellent print in the darkroom. I'm actually a little more concerned about camera shake because it doesn't appear to be razor sharp. But if you were to put a 2 or a 1, or you might even have to go to a 0 filter on this particular negative, you could still get a really good exposure for your print in the darkroom. Just remember that When you do use a filter, 5 gives you the most contrast. So if you want things to become much whiter and much darker, to get pure blacks, pure whites in your photo, you would use a strong filter like a 5. Then you would work your way down. You almost rarely ever have to use a 3 filter because the enlargers are set to give you a contrast of about 2.5 to 3 already. And then if you have a photo like this one that is very overexposed, you can actually use a 2, a 1, or in extreme cases all the way down to a 0 filter, and that'll help bring back some of the details in those overexposed areas of the photo. This one also does have light leak, but this person got super lucky because the light leak didn't actually leak into the print itself. It seems to have just landed on the sprockets. So again, this photo, although way overexposed, would still make a pretty good print in the darkroom. Okay, so we've seen a properly exposed negative, one that was pretty overexposed, and now we'll go to the other end of the spectrum and show you some underexposed negatives. In this case, at the time of exposure, when the camera snapped the picture, not enough light was allowed into the camera by the photographer. So you see that the resulting image is very light, or what we call thin. There's absolutely no density on these negatives whatsoever. In fact, these are so thin that if you were to grab a 5 filter, which would give you the most contrast in the darkroom, I'm pretty sure you would still end up with a very gray, underexposed, sort of a muddy print. There's another learning situation with these particular negatives, because if you notice along the top of the sprockets, you can see that they're kind of really dark, almost black. What that means is the cap popped off of the film at some point. Probably after it was shot by the photographer, they threw it in a backpack, and maybe a heavy book, or if they threw it down on the ground, the pressure on the canister just popped the cap off. And unfortunately, had they exposed these properly, they would have lost all their work and not been able to make some prints. So make sure you protect your film as you're bringing it back to school. All right, this particular shoot we're going to call #developing_probs. This person had their reel, probably the top reel in the tank, and when they added chemical to the tank to start the developing process, they did not fill it high enough. That cylinder that you test your D76 and take the temperature in is not enough chemical to fill that tank completely. So when you're done adding your first round of chemical out of the cylinder, you also have to add some extra and top off the tank at least halfway up the funnel. If you notice that dark, muddy brown line on the bottom of these negatives, that's the section of the reel that once you were finished agitating and you set the tank down and spun it to get the bubbles off, half of the film was actually sitting above and out of the chemical, so it was not developing for at least half of the time that it was in the tank. So make sure you do fill that tank up, and you won't have this problem. And here we have an example of what we were just talking about. This is about how much chemical you would want to place into the tank each time you start the developing process. As you can see, the hole in the funnel is full and the chemical reaches halfway up the funnel. That way you've ensured that when you go to develop, both reels will be completely submerged in chemical the entire time, and you can avoid the problem that we just showed you before. Our final tip of the day is how to handle your negatives in the negative sleeves. It's very important that you're precise with just about everything that you do in photography, and that definitely goes for how you put negatives into the negative sleeve. I would not suggest cleaning your negatives until it's time to make an actual print. Then you can take out that one negative and clean it. That way you're not overhandling your negatives and cleaning them too much, because they tend to get scratched when you do that. So make sure they're completely dry before you try to slide them into the sleeve. If you notice, the word print file is oriented left to right in the upper left corner of this negative sleeve. You also know that when you slide it in emulsion side down, you'll actually see the names of the film. Now in this case it's Kodak, but we'll be using Kentmere this semester. So double check to make sure that your negatives are slid into the negative sleeve properly, and please make sure you take advantage of that white stripe on the top of the negative sleeve. That's a great place to put your own name. In the event you accidentally leave your negatives in the darkroom, we can get them right back to you. You can also label it with the name of the assignment. You're going to accumulate a ton of negative sleeves over the course of the semester. And then when May rolls around and we have to prep for Festival of the Arts, you'll be able to go back and locate the proper negative that you want to print for Festival very quickly. Please don't be afraid to ask myself, Ms. McAleese, or Mr. Burgess questions at any point during the course of the semester. We're happy to help you, and we want to make sure that you have success in photography. Thank you.